All right. Welcome back to our next episode. I was about to say the number and I lost track. I think it's 7. Welcome to our next episode. I'm here again with Colin, uh,
Hello.
and we're going to talk about our next case, Cully versus Marshall. Um, I'm going to say this off the bat. This is a very in the weeds case. It's very jargony. It's very legal heavy. So I'm going to try and make this as digestible as possible and not boring,
Give
because it gets a little boring.
give it a little zhuzh,
Yeah,
right? Just a
yeah.
little.
So this case surrounds due process, basically. So due process and the right to proper legal procedures from a citizen. Specifically in this case, when it comes to civil forfeiture, right? So civil forfeiture meaning when the government takes your
You've
stuff.
you've already triggered my up until recently libertarian self here. I retain the hatred of this, so I will that word itself, sir.
Right.
Continue.
Right. Yeah. Civil forfeiture, meaning the government has taken something, some part of your property for some reason. Um,
They really needed another Ralph's on your front lawn, so it's gone.
this this is slightly different. Well, not even slightly. This is very different. So let me
Okay.
get into the background, and you'll see what.
Apologies.
No, no, no. You'll see what I mean by civil forfeiture. So in 2019, in the state of Alabama, this is the weird thing too. There were two separate incidents that are very, very, very similar. So this is like the weird thing right off the bat. So 2019 in Alabama, two separate but similar incidents, occurred. Halima Cully's car was impounded and seized by the government after her son, who was driving it, was pulled over and found to be in possession of marijuana and other drug paraphernalia.
Oh, in Alabama, that's not good.
Right.
You're in trouble.
Like 2 weeks later, random other woman, Lena Sutton, her car was also seized and impounded by the state after her friend was found with meth in the car. So basically, these two women learned the hard way. Don't let other people drive your car, right? They had nothing to do with this, apparently. Both of
Just don't be
them,
friends with meth heads.
yeah, but both of them let other
That's my
people
policy.
drive their cars, and they got impounded and basically taken from them. Civil forfeiture due to some other person's illegal activities. So the two women, again, separate cases, but the two women were both unable to get their property back until after the cases were brought to trial. So this means they were without their cars, they were without their property for over a year.
Oh,
And Alabama state law stipulates there's only one way that you can get your property back. You can retrieve your property while a case about that property is pending. You have to post a bond worth twice as much as the property.
good Lord.
So these being cars, right? That would have been extremely expensive for these people.
Yes.
So both Cully and Sutton, again, separately sued the state of Alabama and the the attorney general, of Alabama for violations of their due process. So they felt that they did not receive proper due process because they didn't have a separate hearing about the forfeiture of their property, right? So they didn't have a separate hearing saying, well, I'm an innocent bystander in this, and not even really a bystander. I'm an innocent third party in this. Can I have my stuff back, right? Can I have my car back? So they didn't get that extra hearing, and so they sued Alabama for a violation of due process. So here's where we get into some of the weeds and the legal jargon. So as we've talked about before, cases decided by the Supreme Court, obviously they set precedent, right? That other lower courts use in their rulings. Sometimes wrapped up in these decisions is an accompanying what they call a test, right? So these tests are guidelines that set out for lower courts to determine if a similar case, how to view it in the future, right? So it's a test trying to weigh, okay, how do we decide this case based off of the precedent case, previously. There are two such tests that come up in this specific case. So Barker versus Wingo was a case Supreme Court heard. And with that case came one of these tests where the Supreme Court set out 4 factors to determine if a delay in a civil proceeding is justified, right? So Barker versus Wingo set out a 4-tiered system of, can the government actually delay a civil proceeding for justifiable reasons, right? So it's basically talking about the timeliness or the speed of a trial. Another test comes from the case Matthews versus Elridge, which determines the party's interests in the case. So I'm not going to get into these 2 tests because they're very nitpicky and jargony. I'm not going to go through the factors, but I'm going to give you the highlights of how these go into this particular case. So back to these 2 women, right? So Sutton and Cully, they sued again, as I said, state of Alabama, and the district court threw out both the cases, citing the test from Barker versus Wingo. So basically the court said there was not an inordinate amount of time before you were able to get your car back or before you were able to, have a hearing about the trial. And there were valid reasons for having that year go by. So you didn't, there was no violation of your due process. Like we throw out your case. Your case is bogus. They appealed, and it went to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and this is where both cases were combined, right? So again, as stipulated, there were 2 separate cases in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. They've now been combined because they were so similar. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals also sided with the district court and the state of Alabama, saying that, yes, your due process was not violated because you had a timely court case, which, in the legal system, a year is fairly timely. So the big argument here, and obviously they appealed again, it's going to the Supreme Court. So the 2 sides of the argument are Cully and Sutton and their counsel are arguing that the test from Matthews versus Elridge that I referred to earlier should have been the one that applied instead of the Barker test that the lower courts applied. So they feel that the issue of the interest, right? So the government's interest versus the citizen's interest in their property is a more important factor here than the speediness, which is what the Barker test took into account. Plus, the Barker test that they took into account surrounded a criminal case around murder, not a civil case about seizing someone's property. So that again called that into question, the use of that test, that is. Furthermore, the Barker test only asks that the government prove that the government tried to work quickly and not that they actually needed the property being seized, right?
Here's the thing. If we let the government investigate themselves, we'll get a fair and honest, open accounting of what happened for the American people.
Exactly. I completely agree.
It happens with the police. It happens with Watergate. I mean, it's shouldn't. I mean, 9/11 Commission. It's really simple. The government will take care of the government, right?
Yes, and I'm gonna finish the other side before I get into my feelings about this idea of the government's interest.
You brought me on here to be sarcastic, so that's my sarcasm right there. Like,
no, and I appreciate it, and it's gonna come out more. I'll give the other side really quickly, and then we'll talk about it. So the other side, the state of Alabama, and the reason it's called Cully versus Marshall is because the Attorney General of Alabama his last name is Marshall. He argues that the state of Alabama, he says that the state of Alabama has an interest of the citizens directly tied up in the timeliness of the trial. So um, the government, the citizens' interest is to get their property back as soon as possible, right? So in using this idea of the Barker test, which is about speediness of trial, then the government's doing that, right? The government is giving them their property back as soon as possible by speeding up the trial, right? So focusing on a speedy trial as promised by the Barker test would actually be in the citizens' interest, giving them their material back faster. Plus, adding an additional retention hearing, which is what the women asked for, would have even delayed them getting back their property further, is what he argues. And the last thing he argues is that the Matthews test could put the government's interest of keeping property in jeopardy. That's my biggest red flag there.
Yeah, I mean,
this
the
guy from
government's interest.
Alabama, yeah.
I mean, it's they're saying the quiet part out loud.
Basically, yeah. So,
which I guess, I mean, if you're gonna be tyrants, I guess be honest about the fact that you're a tyrant and your interest is not in upholding the private property of your citizens, but in your government property.
well, my question is, what is the government's interest? So, if we're looking at this thing called the Matthews test, which is about weighing the government's interest versus the citizens' interest in their own property.
But as you know, Mitch, I'm certain you do know this. They're trying to think of a way to say this. Apologies, I'm weighing. There's what I want to say, and then there's how I'm going to say it. Various jurisdictions stand to gain from forfeiture and seizure, and
Correct.
make a fair amount of money doing so.
Correct.
So I think that was as charitable as I could have been about it. Yeah.
As nice to the government as you could possibly be.
Well, not because I care, but because I don't want to be squished. So
yeah. But again, this idea of the Matthews test is the interest, right? So the government's interest, weighing the government's interest versus the citizen's interest. The citizen's interest obviously is to get their property back. That's duh. And especially if you can prove in a court of law, you have my car and now I can't go to work because you have my car and I'm losing a lot of stuff because of then their interest is very much higher versus the state who, in all fairness, they need to be transparent, right? If you actually have an interest saying like, we need to keep this car for this reason, then you have to be transparent and say that and let the court decide, is the government interest, does it outweigh the citizen's interest? I can understand that. I can get behind that type of thing. But to completely ignore this quote unquote test, right? And to go for a speediness test, right? Which is what they've done in this case. You're completely, I guess I'm siding with the plaintiffs here, right? You're completely negating the need for the person to get their property back, right?
Yeah.
You're just going off of, well, I mean, you got it back soon enough because we heard your trial and like we did our part, but the government is not being asked to be transparent of, well, why did you need my car for that long?
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm very biased in this regard, and I'm proudly biased towards the citizen in this situation, or the citizens.
Right.
It's just so indicative of the attitude of government towards Americans. There's a real contempt towards Americans by our government. There's a real hatred of people trying to put food on the table. And this is just to me, that's how I see this. This is another example of this attitude playing out in policy.
And I've,
but when people say, I mean, it's a very Twitter kind of thing to say when they hate you. I mean, it's not a lie. Like, no, they actually hate you.
Yeah.
And they don't even feel anything towards you, but they're incredibly callous towards you, which is a form of hatred, right? Like it's a form of dehumanization. So
I don't know. This I said at the beginning this is kind of a boring case, and I mean
Oh,
it kind of is,
oh, this has got
but
me fired up.
but it has some pretty big consequences, I think, because I'm glad that someone has is bringing to the Supreme Court this idea
Me
of
too.
should we value the
Hashtag me too.
interest should we value the interest of the parties being, government versus citizen, or should we value, oh well, the government proved that it did its bare minimum in doing a speedy trial. Like which one is more important? So
Man,
yeah,
just
it's kind
this.
of boring in the legal jargon of all of it, and
Yeah, but
the
just it
weeds of all of it. But
to me, just shows so clearly how little of a standard we place upon our government because they consistently fail and consistent like at their job. It's so again, I guess this is in one place where I'm still kind of a libertarian. I'm just like, wow, it's just really unimpressive.
everything the government touches turns to.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, these are not impressive. None of this is impressive. It's not even like passable. It doesn't even work. Yeah. Don't worry though, because they will find themselves completely in the right because they investigated themselves.
I also find the idea that they're claiming that a year is,
A year.
a speedy trial for people, again, people who were had nothing to do with the cases,
They're
right?
not guilty of anything. They're victims of the circumstance.
Right. Well, they're
We're not
victims of bad judgment. I mean, sorry,
bad judgment, but bad judgment is one thing.
right.
Was anybody, again, it was
It's not
anyone.
against the law.
It's not against the law. And if you start making bad judgment against the law, not outright criminal behavior, but just like, oh, I made a mistake. I should have known better, but I didn't have any ill intent and no one was harmed. I mean, I see what you mean. That's a very dangerous precedent because then it's like, well, then technically anything you do could be construed as having been sort of a poor decision. And therefore then everything you could have could be taken for a year or longer or indefinitely or forever because we say so.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm going to be interested to see the
me too.
decision of
Actually,
this.
you said
However,
it, yeah, you got me all like bored at the start, and then you drop this like thing. I'm like, oh no, this is something I care about. I want to know how this turns out now.
however, I have a feeling that it's going to be extra complicated in the decision, so we'll have to wade through some more weeds.
Bring me back on for it because I want to know.
We'll
No,
see. We'll see.
this is a big thing for me because even though I'm quote unquote not a real libertarian anymore, I am very much I would say working class kind of populist guy, and these kinds of things really affect people who don't have five cars.
Hmm.
These things really affect single mothers, working class people, all the people that the left claims to care about. This kind of stuff really impacts minorities, really impacts, and people who are on lower socioeconomic uh, levels are way more likely to encounter this kind of thing. And every decent statistic will bear that out. Uh, you're more likely to interact with the police or get in one of these situations if you live in a not as great location, and if you're poorer, you're more likely to. Right? So it's just like um,
I have a
it's
feeling
not caring for the. It's definitely it is not caring for normal everyday working Americans or anybody, but it affects the lower rung people more, and that makes me quite angry. So
I have a feeling these two women who got wrapped up in this, they probably were lucky enough to find the ability to take this as far as they have.
I know I'm
I
surprised.
doubt they have money to, to pay legal, bills and all of this stuff. So
Maybe there's some based lawyers out there doing the Lord's work. Who knows?
maybe,
You
hopefully,
might know more about
hopefully.
that than yeah. I don't. Yeah, it's hopefully. Yeah,
But yeah, so we'll see how this one goes out. But yeah, again, government interest versus citizens interest. Who wins?
and who are you? If you're a citizen, keep that in mind. Your interest is different. It's not the same.
Yeah. So we shall reconvene when we know more about What happened to Miss Cully? Oh, and I guess Miss Sutton too, but Cully's name is on the case. So yeah, case dismissed.